In less than 10 minutes, my stepmother erased my name from my father's house, from his wood shop, and from everything he promised me, while a lawyer read his will and my relatives stared at the smiling photo of my father on the wall. We were packed into a small conference room at Mr. Hanley's office in Asheville, two uneven rows of chairs facing the polished table, where my stepmother Patricia sat in a pale suit, close to the framed picture of my dad, in front of his shop and the mountain cabin he always called our safe place. I sat 3 chairs down close enough to hear every word, far enough to feel like an outsider. I told myself I was here for closure, not for money, but every beat of my heart repeated one sentence my father used to say on the cabin porch. "This land will always be yours, Mila, no matter what happens to me." Hanley cleared his throat and began. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Dray, dated January 2024. To my wife, Patricia Dray, I leave the residence at Oak Ridge Drive, the attached workshop, the mountain cabin on Laurel Ridge, and all contents thereof, together with all remaining investment accounts, and the proceeds of my life insurance policy, estimated total value approximately $4.6 million. The number 4.6 million drifted across the room like smoke and settled on my skin. The house where I learned to ride a bike, the shop that smelled like sawdust and coffee, the cabin where my father taught me how to start a fire in the rain, all slid quietly into one sentence that did not include my name. Behind me, a chair creaked. Someone exhaled. Patricia lifted her chin and turned toward me. Her mouth curved into a gentle, sympathetic smile that somehow still felt like a threat. "It is what he wanted, sweetie," she said in a voice just loud enough for everyone. "You are independent now." One of my aunts nodded and murmured, "Well, at least you got your education," as if that balanced what I had just lost. A cousin whispered, "Did not she move away for years anyway?" And the question hung in the air like an accusation. I stared at the wood grain in the table and felt the heat rise in my chest. Hanley turned a page. As for my daughter Mila Dray, he read, "I trust that she is fully capable of providing for herself. I have supported her education and given her every advantage. It is my wish that she learn to stand on her own 2 feet without depending on my estate." That was it. No mention of the cabin he told me was mine one day. No mention of the shop where I swept floors as a teenager and packed orders during college breaks. No mention of the promise he made under that very porch light, now glowing behind his smile in the photograph beside my stepmother. Across the table, Patricia dabbed at one eye with a tissue and turned toward the small knot of church friends sitting behind us. "You all know how stubborn he was," she said with a helpless little shrug. "He just did not want things to get ugly after he was gone. Better to keep it simple." The message slid neatly into the room. If I questioned anything, I would be the one making it ugly. A woman from our church leaned sideways and whispered, "Some kids only come back when they smell money," and I felt the words slide under my ribs. I wanted to tell them about the late-night calls with doctors, the weekends I drove in from my apartment, the nights I slept on the lumpy den couch, while Patricia paced the hallway on speakerphone talking about insurance and home equity. I wanted to say I did not come for money, I came because my father was dying. Instead, I sat very still and let them believe the version of me my stepmother had been sketching for years, the distant daughter who suddenly cared once a dollar amount was attached. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Out of habit, I glanced down. Elder fraud, task force internal. The subject line mentioned a case I had helped flag the week before, a son quietly draining his mother's account using power of attorney. For a moment, the room blurred, and all I could see in my mind were the training slides from work, the list of warning signs, sudden document changes, isolated elder, new gatekeeper who controls every visit, every call, every signature. I looked up at the will in Hanley's hand at my stepmother sitting so close to my father's picture and felt something sharp push through the fog of grief. When the reading ended, chairs scraped against the floor and people began to stand talking in low, careful voices as if we were at a funeral reception. Patricia leaned closer, her perfume sweet and heavy. "You know, Mila," she said brightly, "money changes people. Your father just did not want you fighting over his things when you barely visited. At least now you are free to live your own life without all this old wood dragging you down." Someone near the door added at least your stepmom was there. When it counted, some daughters only show up when there is an inheritance. I only nodded because if I opened my mouth, I was afraid the words that came out would never stop. I walked past my father's smiling face out through the heavy glass door and into a gray afternoon that smelled like rain and exhaust. The copy of the will was folded so tight in my hand that the edge cut into my palm. By the time I reached the sidewalk, a cold drizzle had started soaking my blouse, cooling the flush on my cheeks. I was unlocking my car when I heard my name, thin and shaky, over the sound of traffic. Mila. I turned. Under the overhang by the door stood Joan, the hospice nurse, who had helped my father through his last week, her badge still clipped to her sweater, her purse clutched close to her body. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and frightened. "I was there when he signed," she said quietly. It was not like she said. For a heartbeat, the traffic noise dimmed, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. "What do you mean?" I asked, taking a step toward her. Joan blinked fast, like someone waking from a bad dream. I should not have said that, she whispered. I did not say anything. Then she turned and walked quickly down the sidewalk into the rain shoulders, hunched the small shape of her body swallowed by the gray light. I stood there in the parking lot with wet hair and a stinging palm, and my father's promises echoing in my head, and I felt my grief begin to harden into something colder and steadier. That afternoon, my stepmother believed she had taken everything my father left behind. She did not know that some women cannot stay silent forever, and that I had spent years learning exactly what happens when someone tries to rewrite the truth on paper and call it love. I was 25 when I moved back to Asheville after finishing my degree, still carrying the smell of long nights at the library and the quiet pride of landing my first real job at a regional bank. And although the apartment I rented off Merriman Avenue had peeling paint around the windows and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the traffic outside, it felt like the beginning of something steady, a life where effort turned into progress. But when Dad introduced me to Trish that fall, it became clear that progress in my own life meant very little in the world my father now lived in. Dad met her at a real estate seminar, or at least that was the story she liked to tell with a gentle laugh, a hand on his arm and the kind of smile that made people feel slightly foolish for asking too many questions. And she carried herself like someone who had always known the correct way to talk about property values, equity renovations, and how men needed partners who understood the language of money, not daughters who were still in her words, figuring out who they wanted to be. The first dinner we had together was at the house on Oak Ridge Drive, the long wooden table set with placemats that looked like they had been ironed, the air filled with the scent of rosemary chicken. And I remember how she leaned forward while passing the salad bowl and asked in a lilting tone what exactly I did at the bank. "Your dad tells me you are in banking." "Mila, that must be nice, just clicking around screens while he is lifting real wood all day." And before I could answer, she gave a soft, sympathetic laugh, the kind that implies she already knew everything worth knowing. And Dad just rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing. A silence that settled heavier than any insult she could have spoken outright. I smiled the way people smile when they are trying not to embarrass the person who should be defending them, and that smile stayed with me through dessert, through dishes, through the moment I drove home alone wondering why my father could build a cabin from the foundation up but could not manage one sentence to remind me I had value. The following months passed in a rhythm that felt familiar but slightly off-key weekends, spent visiting Dad at the shop where the sharp scent of cut lumber mixed with the smell of his peppermint coffee evenings, when he invited me to eat at the cabin he had bought years before when money and hope seemed abundant, a small place on Laurel Ridge where the mountains felt close enough to touch, and one cool November night, while we sat on the porch, wrapped in flannel blankets, He looked out toward the tree line and said quietly that the land, the shop, and the cabin were meant to be my safety net one day. A promise he spoke the way people speak when they believe time is still generous. I laughed and told him I planned to have my own safety net too. Dad and he smiled in that patient way of his, unaware that I was not joking, unaware that I had already saved enough from working double shifts during college to buy a small duplex in Knoxville. A simple building with old brick and stubborn plumbing that I had renovated room by room with careful budgeting, and a loan I paid off early, unaware that I had tenants whose rent covered the mortgage, and built a cushion that kept me secure even when life shifted unexpectedly. I never told him because he liked believing I needed his advice, and I did not want to take that pleasure from him. But Trish seemed to sense something she could not name, a discomfort that flickered across her face whenever Dad spoke warmly about my independence, and she began to reshape the way people saw the shop and the cabin, often telling friends who visited that the business was Tom's legacy, and she was just making sure it would not be wasted or sold for peanuts one day, always with a gentle shake of the head and a look toward me that suggested some daughters were not quite equipped to keep something so valuable running, and slowly, that idea spread into the community, into church gatherings, into backyard barbecues, where people would pat her arm and tell her it was lucky Tom had someone who understood real assets. One evening, when I suggested helping Dad transition the wood shop to online orders so his handmade pieces could reach buyers across the country, she gave me a soft, dismissive smile and said, "Sweetheart, not everything needs to become some tech project. Let the grown-ups handle the real assets." And Dad chuckled as if it were harmless, but the laugh pressed against me like a door, closing a reminder that in their eyes, I was still the child who swept sawdust off the floor, while adults handled the complicated parts of life. At work, the reality looked different because by then I had moved from basic customer accounts to a small team that handled unusual transaction patterns, cases that hinted at elder financial abuse, and I spent long, careful hours analyzing withdrawals, transfers, signatures that did not match, and guardians or relatives whose stories changed from call to call. One afternoon, my supervisor handed me a thick folder of a case involving a son who used power of attorney to drain nearly every cent from his mother's savings, and he told me that I saw patterns other people missed, that this was why they trusted me with the heavy cases, and the validation felt like stepping into sunlight after years of standing in fog. But none of this made its way back to Oak Ridge Drive because whenever I visited Dad and mentioned a project at work, Trish would blink and say, "Oh, banking must be stressful, all those numbers," and then she would transition the conversation back to the shop and how much responsibility it was for her to help Tom keep things running, and over time she turned from a new presence into a gatekeeper embedded into every part of his life. A presence that smiled kindly, even while nudging me gently out of the frame. Yet beneath the surface, I continued to build the quiet stability I had promised myself, tracking rental income from the duplex, adding to a personal investment account that Dad did not know existed, reading every new policy update about financial guardianship and elder exploitation. And without fully understanding why I kept these things private, I sensed that one day, transparency would cost me more than silence. By the time Dad married Trish, the shift was complete, and I felt myself placed just outside the center of his life, not banished outright, but positioned carefully, where my presence would not interfere with the narrative she was creating, a narrative where she was the protector of his legacy, and I was the daughter who drifted in and out without any real sense of responsibility. She did not know that while I sat politely at her dinner table, smiling through the small indignities, she layered into every conversation I had already seen. Too many cases where a new spouse gained control of documents, redirected conversations, isolated family members, and rewrote an estate behind closed doors, while claiming it was all for the good of the family. She did not know that I recognized the patterns because I was the one professionals consulted when those patterns turned into proof. She did not know that the girl she dismissed as someone who clicked around screens all day had quietly built assets of her own and was becoming an expert in the exact type of betrayal she believed she could carry out without anyone noticing. January arrived with the kind of rain that makes Asheville streets shine like wet stone, and on a cold night near the end of the month when most people were asleep, I was sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing a cluster of suspicious withdrawals for a case that had been escalated to our team, when my phone lit up at 2 a.m. with a number I did not recognize, and before I could steady my breath, a tight voice on the line said, "Your father collapsed at the shop he is at Mission Hospital," and the world around me shrank into a single point of sound, while the rest of the apartment faded as if someone had pulled the oxygen out of the room and left me suspended between disbelief and dread. I grabbed my coat keys bag, everything that felt like action, even though none of it could change the fact that Dad was lying somewhere behind hospital walls, and I drove through empty streets with my heart beating so hard it felt louder than the wipers scraping across my windshield, and when I rushed through the sliding doors, the bright white hallway lights hit my eyes like a slap, almost as harsh as the words of the nurse, who stepped forward and told me in a measured tone that his wife had asked, "They keep visitors limited because he needed rest," and for a moment I could not understand why a daughter would be considered a disturbance in a situation where time was the only thing that mattered. Before I could protest, Trish appeared from around the corner wearing a soft sweater and an expression of weary authority as if she'd been carrying the world alone, and she looked at me with a thin, controlled smile and said, "He barely knows you are here." Mila let the doctors do their job, and something inside me tightened a small breaking sound that no one else could hear, because the way she said it erased years of shared moments in a single breath, as if my presence was an inconvenience rather than a right. When a doctor approached with a clipboard, she spoke before I could find my words, explaining in her smooth tone that I lived on my laptop not in this town, and that she had been the one handling his medications for years, and I watched the doctor nod politely as he scribbled notes, while my identity as his daughter, the person who loved him more quietly but no less fiercely, was reduced to a footnote in his medical chart. I tried to step around her to ask directly how Dad was doing, but the nurse quickly glanced at Trish instead of me, as if permission belonged solely to her, and the humiliation washed over me in a slow, burning wave that made my hands tremble. Then in the small whiteboard behind the nurse's station, something caught my eye, and because my work had trained me to read details as if they were warnings, I saw under the box labeled POA, the name Patricia Dray, followed by the words, "Updated last week," and the back of my neck prickled as if someone had whispered a secret I was not supposed to hear. And before I could process it, I heard a doctor ask Trish something about the healthcare proxy form he had received, something she waved off with an indulgent explanation about how complicated paperwork can be for older men. And although I did not yet fully understand the timeline, I felt the familiar click of suspicion settling into place like a puzzle piece I had been unconsciously holding. Still, I begged to see him, saying softly that I only wanted a minute. But Trish raised her voice just enough for the doctor and 2 nurses to hear, and said, "Now you show up when there is drama. Where were you on the boring hard days?" And her words were so sharp, they seemed to echo against the walls, making the staff stare at the floor, as if acknowledging the cruelty would make them responsible for intervening. I stood there feeling like a trespasser in my own father's final hours, and in that moment, I understood something about how power works in sterile hallways, how easily authority can shift to the person who speaks first and loudest, how quickly a daughter can be treated like an outsider when someone else frames the narrative with a confident voice. Over the next hours, I waited in the lobby, pacing around chairs that creaked under fluorescent lights, checking my phone again and again in case someone updated me. But no call came, and when exhaustion finally pulled me back to my apartment, the sky was beginning to lighten as if nothing tragic had happened at all. A few days later, while I sat at my desk resolving a fraud claim involving a forged signature, my phone buzzed with a message from Trish, a short, clean sentence that landed like a stone in my chest. He is gone. It was peaceful. No need to rush. And for several seconds I could not move, because the words were both final and dismissive, as if she were informing a casual acquaintance of a scheduling change rather than telling a daughter her father had taken his last breath without her beside him. I stared at the screen and felt a hollow ache spread through me. The ache of knowing the most irreversible moment of his life had been guarded from me. The ache of realizing that someone else had controlled not only his medical decisions, but also my access to him. The ache that older women speak of when they describe being pushed out of their parents' final days by a new spouse who uses kindness as a curtain and authority as a blade. Later, when I looked again at the timeline on the hospital board stored in my memory, the updated power of attorney and the newly signed healthcare proxy began to form a shadowed outline that made my stomach twist, because nothing about those documents being changed so close to his collapse felt accidental, and although I had no proof yet, the certainty had already begun to grow quietly inside me. The certainty that someone had prepared for the moment when my father could no longer speak for himself, and that the person who had done it was the same woman who had smiled while blocking me from his room. The day of the funeral, the church felt smaller than I remembered a white building on a quiet street, where the parking lot overflowed with cars, and as I walked down the center aisle behind my father's casket, I saw the framed photo of him on a small easel near the front, smiling in front of the wood shop he loved, and for a second I had to grip the back of a pew to steady myself as the choir began a hymn that sounded like every goodbye I had never wanted to say. People filled the benches, and in the front row, Trish sat with a black scarf over her shoulders, dabbing her eyes at all the right moments. And when I stepped to the podium to read the words I had written, my voice shook so hard I thought it might break. I talked about the shop and the cabin, about how Dad could turn rough boards into something useful, about how he once drove hours to fix a leak in my college apartment, because the landlord would not return my calls, and as I spoke I saw heads nodding and tears glistening. But I also saw the way Trish looked up at me, with a faint, indulgent smile like someone watching a child recite a poem, and the sight lodged in my throat like a splinter. After the service, we moved to the fellowship hall behind the sanctuary, a long room with folding tables covered in plastic tablecloths and dishes people had carried in casseroles, and fried chicken and desserts on paper plates, and the hum of conversation rose and fell beneath the lights while I stood near a corner holding a cup of sweet tea I could not bring myself to drink. Every time someone approached me, their face wore the same expression, a blend of sympathy and something sharper, and almost every conversation slid toward the question of what would happen to the shop and the cabin, to the house on Oak Ridge, to the life my father had built, plank by plank. A cousin of mine, red-faced from a little too much of the punch, sidled up and clapped me on the shoulder, his voice louder than the room required as he said so. "Mila, you get the cabin right, lucky girl." And the words hung in the air because people nearby went quiet to hear my answer, as if my inheritance were entertainment, laid out between the trays of food. I opened my mouth, not sure what I planned to say, but before any sound came out, Trish appeared at my side with the smooth speed of someone who had been waiting just off stage, and she placed a light hand on my shoulder and said, "Actually, Tom was worried about enabling her. He trusted me to handle everything. Mila is too smart to depend on. Inheritance. Are you not, honey?" Her voice carrying easily across the closest tables so that heads turned and polite smiles appeared, and a few people chuckled in that awkward way people do when they are not sure which side they should be on. Heat flooded my face, and I forced a small smile while my throat burned, because if I contradicted her in that moment, if I said that the cabin had been promised to me for years, I knew it would land not as truth, but as ingratitude, as a spoiled daughter, grasping for more than she deserved. An older woman from church leaned in from across the table with a sigh and said, Well, at least your education was paid for. Dear kids these days want the house, the business, and a thank you card, and a ripple of nervous laughter moved through the group as if she had voiced what they all believed. I swallowed hard and nodded as though they were right, even while my mind flashed back to extra shifts during school, the nights I worked closing at a diner, and studied on my break the loan documents I signed without asking Dad for a cent, the quiet satisfaction of paying those balances down on my own, all of it, erased by a single story told in a confident tone beside a tray of ham biscuits. After that moment, the glances people gave me changed, growing softer and more judgmental, at the same time as if I were both pitiable and suspect the daughter who had flown off to her digital life and now circled back around the estate, pulled by the gravity of money. Later, as I stood near the coffee urn trying to catch my breath, I heard Trish recounting a polished version of events to a small cluster of church ladies. Her voice drifting across the clink of cups, she was saying, "Tom always said Mila did not really want the cabin because she loves the city, all that computer work and travel. He worried she would feel tied down, so he told me, 'Let it go, where it will be cared for.'" And their heads bobbed in agreement, while I stood frozen a few yards away, remembering the nights on that porch when he called the cabin my home base, his exact words, a place you can always come back to. In my mind, I began to line up the pieces the way I did for work. Motive, the value of the house, the shop, the land opportunity, the updated power of attorney and healthcare proxy filed just before his stroke. Control the way she stood between me and every conversation that involved his health or his finances, and now narrative control. The story she was cementing in the community that I did not want, the very things she had signed for. I could see it so clearly that for a moment my professional instincts pushed me to speak. But when I looked around the hall, all I saw were faces turned toward her with trust people who had seen her at his bedside, who had received her updates, and I knew that anything I said would be heard through the filter she had already set, the filter that painted me as distant and ungrateful. Standing there with a cooling cup in my hand, I felt the weight of what it means to be written out of your own story while you are still breathing, knowing that if I objected, I would be labeled greedy or unstable or disrespectful to the dead. That afternoon in the fellowship hall, Trish did something more lasting than sign a document. She rewrote history in front of an entire church, telling them I never wanted the cabin or the shop. And as the nods and murmurs wrapped around her words, I realized that any move I made to challenge her would look not like a daughter defending a promise, but like a scavenger circling what she thought she deserved, a role I felt pressing against me, even as I refused to accept it. The week after the funeral felt like a blur of paperwork condolences, and a silence so heavy it followed me from room to room. And one afternoon, when the January light slanted through my apartment windows, I opened the envelope from Attorney Hanley, expecting nothing more than a formal summary, and instead found a neatly folded letter, clipped to a full copy of the new will, with a note in his tidy handwriting, saying, "Tom wanted to avoid conflict, so he left everything to Patricia," and the words hit me like another funeral bell, because they carried the same insinuation everyone had repeated in that fellowship hall, that I was someone who needed to be managed, someone who could not be trusted with her own father's intentions. I sat on the couch and unfolded the pages, slowly reading line after line, feeling the weight of each sentence. Then I took a deep breath, walked to my desk, opened the folder where I kept old emails, and scrolled until I found the attachment Dad had sent me in 2020, the will he had been so proud of, the one he called his promise to me. And I printed both documents, placing them side by side on the kitchen counter, where the differences leapt forward like bruises under bright light. The dates did not match. The phrasing was entirely different. The tone shifted from a warm and personal voice to a cold, distant formality, and the signature on the new document wavered in uneven strokes that looked nothing like his handwriting. My pulse picked up, not from excitement, but from the familiar click in my mind, the same click I felt when a case at work started revealing patterns, and without even realizing it, I began pulling sticky notes and a stack of printer paper from the drawer clearing space on the wall ahead of me. I wrote, Day 1, power of attorney updated, then day 3, hospitalization, then next, will signed, followed by refinance inquiry and home equity line. And as I pinned each piece to the wall, a timeline formed like a crime board in slow motion, and I stared at it, feeling the quiet throb of recognition, because this was the structure I used daily, tracking abuses, unraveling manipulations, watching the path from opportunity to exploitation. Something inside me steadied the way it did in the office when everyone else was flustered while I found the thread in the data, and I kept going because I knew the picture was not complete. I opened the Buncombe County Online Records portal, typing in the property IDs for the cabin and the workshop, expecting to find the same records I had always seen. But instead, a new filing popped up dated 48 hours after the funeral. A home equity line issued under Mila Dray, secured by the cabin and the workshop, together a line of credit that only the surviving spouse could take out. But the speed of it, the way the ink on the death certificate had barely dried, made my stomach turn, and I pushed back from the desk, gripping the edge of the chair, because there was no way this was about protecting assets or honoring a legacy. This was a plan, a rapid extraction of value from everything Dad had built. My breath shook, and I leaned closer to the screen, rereading the filing 3, 4, 5 times to make sure I was not imagining it, and each time the numbers stared back at me with the same cold certainty. It became impossible to ignore the truth that Trish had never intended to hold on to these properties. She had intended to use them, and use them fast. As the realization settled in my chest, I reached for my phone, opened the real estate app I used for my rentals, and checked the duplex in Knoxville, seeing both units occupied, rent deposited that morning. Mortgage auto paid without issue. Then I opened my brokerage account, watching the index fund balance hover around $170,000, and a calm, unexpected thought formed in the middle of my shaking breath that I did not need the $4.6 million to live, not for rent or food or safety, not for independence or identity. I wanted the cabin and the shop because Dad had placed them in my hands long before any signature on any document, because he trusted I would protect what he loved, and someone had taken that trust and bent it to her own advantage without fear of consequence. The insult of the potluck comments from the fellowship hall replayed in my mind, and I heard again the words, "Kids these days want the house, the business, and a thank you card." Then the chorus of murmurs, the implication that I stood in that room greedy for something I never earned, and the words Tom wanted to avoid conflict painted the same image of a daughter who could not be trusted. In that moment, standing in my quiet kitchen, with the timeline on the wall glowing under the lamp, I felt the anger rise, but beneath it, something stronger, a cold clarity that came from years of dissecting elder fraud cases, reading how families twisted legal forms until the truth was unrecognizable. And I whispered to myself, "They call me greedy. When I am the only one in that room who does not need this money to survive, I need it because it is the only promise he ever made to me, and someone decided they had the right to erase it." That sentence sat heavy in my chest as I turned back to the timeline, letting the weight of it settle into purpose, and I realized this was the first moment in weeks when something made sense. The first moment when sorrow and shock began shifting into direction, and I understood that whatever happened next would not be about inheritance or comfort. It would be about truth and the right of a daughter to hold her father's last words without them being rewritten by someone who thought no one would question her. A few days after I finished the timeline on my wall, I realized staring at arrows and dates would never be enough, so I booked an appointment with an independent attorney, and on a dull Tuesday afternoon, I sat across from Evelyn Carter in a narrow office that smelled of paper and coffee, laying out the 2 wills, the power of attorney note from the hospital board, the property filings, all the details that had been clawing at the back of my mind. She listened in silence, her pen moving only to circle dates and underline names, then leaned back and told me in a steady voice that what I was describing fell under undue influence and questions of capacity. 2 phrases I knew from work, but had never heard pointed at my own family, and she added that both were very hard to prove because suspicion was not evidence, and judges did not overturn signed documents just because a daughter felt something was wrong. I asked what it would take, and she listed it out like items on a grocery receipt. A doctor willing to say my father was not fully competent when he signed a witness ready to testify that he was pushed, medical records showing confusion, handwriting analysis, expert reports, each one another rung on a ladder built from money and time. And as she spoke, I felt my shoulders tighten, because I could see the size of the fight for the first time. When I asked how long all of that could take, she said 18 to 24 months if things went well longer, if Patricia contested every step. And when I asked about the cost, she did not hide it. She said tens of thousands of dollars, even if we settled before a full trial, then looked at me with clear, tired eyes and asked, "Are you prepared for that? Not in theory, but in real life. Are you ready for this to become a second job that will follow you home every night?" My mind jumped to my careful spreadsheets, to the mortgage on the duplex in Knoxville, to the index fund I had nursed from nothing, and they all felt suddenly fragile, measured against a system that seemed designed for people who could afford to bleed money for years. And in that moment, I understood on a gut level what so many women meant when they said they could not afford justice, not because they had no case, but because they had no extra life to feed into the machine. I told Miss Carter I did not know if I could carry that load, and she nodded as if she had heard that sentence many times, pushing her card across the desk and saying, "If you walk away, it does not make you a bad daughter. It makes you a human being, choosing your own health. But if you decide to fight, we will only move forward with facts, no threats, no drama, just the record." That night, I sat on my couch, replaying her words while my best friend watched me through a phone screen, and when I told her about the 18 to 24 months and the cost and the way the whole thing felt like standing at the bottom of a well, she listened, then said softly, "Is it worth it? You already have a good job. You are not going to starve. Maybe you should just let it go." And although she meant kindness, the suggestion slid over the same sore place that all the church comments had the quiet assumption that wanting what I had been promised made me greedy. A few days later at work, while I stared at a row of suspicious withdrawals, a coworker who only knew my dad had died leaned over my cubicle and joked, "You of all people should know chasing bad money is expensive," then walked away, chuckling, not realizing that his throwaway line had landed on top of the same question Miss Carter had asked, whether I was really ready to trade years of my life for a fight I might not win. That evening, the apartment felt too small, the timeline on the wall too loud, and for the first time I walked over, meaning to pull it all down to tell myself that my father would not have wanted me drained by lawyers and hearings, that the wise thing would be to let the buildings and land go and keep my peace. And my hand was already halfway to the first piece of tape when another thought cut through, that if I surrendered now, Patricia's story would harden into the only version anyone ever believed. Before I made any decision, I knew I owed myself one more conversation. So I called Joan, the hospice nurse, whose voice had cracked in the hallway outside Hanley's office. And when she answered, she sounded cautious, like someone picking up a phone they had been afraid would ring, and I gently reminded her of what she had said, that it had not been like Patricia described when the papers were signed. There was a long silence on the line before she whispered that Patricia had come by her house after the funeral, that she had sat at Joan's kitchen table with a casserole and a calm smile, and talked about how complicated court cases could be, how witnesses sometimes found their names in public records, how one misunderstanding about an old man's confusion could ruin a nurse's reputation, and as Joan repeated those phrases, her voice shook so badly, I had to sit down. She said, "I am so sorry, Mila. I know what I saw, but I cannot be dragged into a legal mess. My husband is not. Well, I do not have the strength for depositions and cross-examination, and although every part of me wanted to beg, I made myself say I understand, because I knew too well what fear of the system felt like I was living it. When I hung up, the apartment seemed to shrink, the hum of the refrigerator and the traffic outside sounding far away. And for the first time, the fight no longer looked like a puzzle. I could methodically solve it, look like a wall backed by Patricia's money and charm, and by the silence she had already purchased, with a few carefully chosen threats. I went to the cardboard box of my father's things, meaning only to tuck the will copies inside and clear the table. And when I lifted a stack of receipts, a folded scrap of paper slid out and landed at my feet, his handwriting on the outside in rough, uneven letters that still made my throat tighten, and when I opened it, I read the simple line cabin for Mila's future, no matter what, and felt my knees give way so that I ended up sitting on the floor with the note in my hands. The words were not legal language. There were no witnesses or stamps or clauses, just my father talking to himself in ink before strokes and confusion and proxies, and in that moment, I knew that whatever any court said, this was the truth I was trying to defend, that the property was not just an asset on a spreadsheet, but the promise of a safe place he had wanted me to have. I cried then in a way I had not allowed at the funeral or in front of anyone else, deep, shaking sobs that carried grief and anger and the tiredness of a woman who suddenly saw how small she was against a whole system. And when the storm finally passed, I sat very still and felt something shift. Not a bright surge of courage, but a quiet refusal to let Patricia be the only one who left a record. I still did not know if I would file a lawsuit or how I would pay for a long court battle, but I understood there was one small piece of this I could control. Without asking anyone's permission, I could make sure the evidence I had could not be wiped away as easily as my name had been erased in that office. So I stood up, wiped my face, sat at my desk, and spent the rest of the night printing clean copies of every document, scanning each page into my laptop, labeling folders by date and type, uploading them to a secure cloud account. Patricia knew nothing about sending, read only links to my secondary email and to Miss Carter's secure address, building a quiet insurance policy that could outlive any missing file or sudden fire. And when I finally closed the computer, my eyes burned, but my breathing had steadied. The tunnel ahead was still dark, and the odds still looked terrible. Yet knowing that there were now copies, no one could slip into a shredder, made me feel, for the first time since the will reading, that I had taken at least one deliberate step instead of being pushed, that even a cornered daughter could claim a small piece of control while she decided whether to bring the whole machine down on the woman who thought she had already won. I was sitting at my small dining table staring at the folders I had organized the night before when my phone rang close to 10:30. And for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail because my mind was too tired to be dragged back into anything. But when I saw Joan's name on the screen, my chest tightened and I answered, hearing nothing at first except uneven breathing, until she finally whispered that she could not sleep and that her husband had told her the truth would ruin her if she kept swallowing it, and the sound of her voice trembling with something deeper than fear made me sit up straight, because I knew immediately this was not a social call. She asked if we could meet somewhere quiet, not her house and not mine, so we settled on a small diner off the highway, the kind that stayed open late for truckers and night shift nurses, where no one paid attention to anyone else. And 20 minutes later, I pulled into the half-lit parking lot, the sign buzzing faintly above the door. Inside the diner, the white fluorescent lights washed everything in a pale glow, and the place smelled of coffee and fried onions. And at a booth near the back, I saw Joan hunched over a mug, her coat still on, and a small worn notebook placed carefully in front of her, like it might fall apart if she let go. She looked older than she had at the lawyer's office. Her eyes ringed with exhaustion, and when I slid into the seat, she reached for my hand with both of hers, as if she needed something physical to anchor her before she began. She said she could not keep the memory of that night buried any longer, that every time she closed her eyes, she saw my father's face half turned toward the door, his voice rough and confused as he asked whether I had called, whether I was coming. And as she spoke, her voice cracked, and she repeated his exact words. Mila, did she call? and I felt something in my chest twist because I could almost hear his voice in hers. She said that Trish had stood at the other side of the bed holding a clipboard and had answered before Joan could, saying, "I was too busy with my online job," and had told her that I trusted her to handle everything. And when Joan said those sentences out loud, her face tightened like the memory tasted bitter in her mouth. She described how my father drifted in and out one moment, confused, and the next half aware how he tried to read the papers, but his eyes kept sliding away from the lines, and how Trish had taken his hand gently, almost tenderly, guiding it down the page to the signature line, telling him softly where to sign, telling him everything was just a formality, telling him I had agreed, while Joan stood frozen with the knowledge that none of those things were true. As she spoke, she flipped open the little notebook and slid a folded sheet across the table toward me, her hand shaking slightly, and when I opened it, I saw a copy of an internal note. She had written the night Dad signed the documents, the kind of note nurses write in case someone questions their actions later, and the words written plainly in ink said patient, sedated, oriented times. One family pushing for paperwork, and the phrase hit me so hard I had to set the page down because it confirmed what I had suspected but had not been able to prove. Joan swallowed hard and said she had kept the note hidden because she had been afraid someone would accuse her of breaking confidentiality or blame her for not stopping the signing. And then she told me something that made the lights in the diner seem suddenly brighter, that after my father passed, Trish had visited her home under the pretense of gratitude and had tried to hand her a thick envelope of cash, saying she wanted to thank her for keeping everything smooth. And when Joan refused to take it, Patricia's face had gone cold in a way Joan said she would never forget. I asked her why she had not come forward earlier, and she said her job depended on her reputation, that one accusation of impropriety could destroy the career she had built over decades, and that she and her husband had quietly agreed she would stay out of anything that smelled like litigation because they could not afford to be dragged through courts and depositions. But when she saw me standing at the church, being side-eyed and subtly shamed, when she heard the whisper that I barely visited, when she watched me smile while swallowing humiliation, none of which I deserved, she realized that her silence tied her to what Patricia had done, whether she wanted it or not. She looked at me with eyes full of guilt and said, "I watched you stand there being called ungrateful when I knew who signed what and how, and that is on me too, if I stay quiet." And I felt the words cut through the fog that had wrapped around me for weeks. I told her I did not want her lying for me or embellishing anything, that if we moved forward it had to be clean and exact, because I refused to fight Patricia with the same tactics Patricia had used on me. And Joan nodded, saying she wanted nothing more than the truth in daylight, where no one could twist it. She reached for her notebook again and tore out a second page containing the timestamp and chart reference of the sedation dose my father had been given that evening, another detail that would matter later, and handed it to me without hesitation, as if giving me a piece of weight she had carried for too long. For a moment, we sat in silence while a waitress passed by with a pot of coffee, the clatter of dishes filling the space between us, and I realized that this was the turning point Ms. Carter had said every case needed, the moment when the story shifted, when it no longer belonged entirely to the person who had tried to bury it. Joan had not just broken her silence, she had handed me the first solid proof that my father had not been in a condition to understand what he was signing, and more importantly, she had shown that Patricia had tried to buy her silence with cash, a detail that would be devastating when laid out in front of anyone who understood elder exploitation. As I folded the pages and slipped them carefully into my bag, Joan reached out once more and said that whatever happened next, she wanted to be able to look at herself in the mirror, that fear had guided her long enough, and that this time she would not be the reason. Truth stayed hidden, and I felt something steady rise in me. Not triumph, but a new center of gravity, the first true shift from being trapped in someone else's story to beginning to rewrite my own. The night after meeting Joan, I sat at my desk, staring at the pages she had given me. the internal note with the sedation status, the timestamp of the dose, the description of my father's confusion, and slowly the emotional fog that had clouded me for weeks thinned into a sharp, cold clarity, the same clarity that came over me at work when a messy fraud case finally revealed its spine. And I realized that if I kept approaching this like a grieving daughter, I would drown. But if I approached it like a professional, like the analyst I had trained myself to be, then I could move through each step with purpose instead of fear. I stood up and walked to the wall where the timeline hung, reading each date and arrow as if it were a case file. And in my mind, I reframed everything into terms I understood. Victim, my father; perpetrator, spouse with power of attorney pattern. Sudden legal changes followed by immediate attempts to monetize assets. And as I looked at the pattern mapped out in front of me, I felt the first spark of strategic distance returning to my mind. The next morning at work, I waited until lunchtime, then walked to the break room where two attorneys from the bank's internal compliance team were talking quietly over sandwiches, and I approached them with the most neutral tone I could manage, asking a theoretical question about a hypothetical elder exploitation case in which a family member rushed to change documents while the patient was sedated, then opened lines of credit and moved insurance money immediately after death. And they did not know I was describing my own life. They simply answered from their training, explaining that any financial institution has a duty to pause suspicious activity once a report is submitted, that the key was not accusation, but proper documentation and timely reporting, because once a complaint is filed, the bank must investigate regardless of personal relationships. I asked how an anonymous party might proceed in a similar situation, pretending I was handling something for a client, and they mentioned adult protective services. They mentioned how APS reports trigger internal reviews. They mentioned that most elder exploitation cases fall apart because the families do not understand the sequence of events or the documentation needed, and I felt a quiet certainty forming behind my ribs because those exact weaknesses were the things I knew how to strengthen. When I returned to my desk and logged into the system with my employee credentials, I reminded myself to stay on the ethical line, not crossing into confidential disclosures, but in the process of reviewing an unrelated file, I saw a name flash on the customer dashboard that made my breath catch. For a moment, Patricia Dray new account opened days after my father's death, large deposit from life insurance, and although I did not click anything, I was not permitted to open. The simple existence of the entry told me everything I needed about timing, about intention, about urgency. And I leaned back in my chair, feeling something shift again, because money did not lie. Transactions did not lie. Patterns did not lie. I knew I could not use my access to interfere, but I could use the information ethically by passing the burden to the proper channels, the ones who had power separate from me, the ones who would not see me as an emotional daughter, but as a complainant, reporting a sequence of events that raised every red flag in the book. That evening, I called Miss Carter and told her everything Joan had revealed, not details beyond what was appropriate, but the core facts, and within an hour she had drafted a formal report to Adult Protective Services, attaching the medical note, the sedation status, the timeline, and the evidence of rapid financial activity, and she submitted it with my name listed as the reporting party, not as an accuser, but as a concerned relative, bringing potential elder exploitation to the state's attention. Once APS logged the report, Ms. Carter notified the probate court requesting a temporary freeze on all estate-related transactions until capacity and undue influence could be evaluated, and the judge granted an interim order, a small but significant crack in Patricia's control, because it meant her plans to sell the cabin or expand the home equity line would be halted until the investigation concluded. When the freeze order reached the bank, it triggered an internal compliance review, automatic and detached a process that did not care about family dynamics or interpersonal charm. And when compliance noticed the large insurance deposit and the timing relative to the death certificate, they flagged the account for review. Not by me, but by the team whose entire job was to ensure no one exploited a vulnerable adult's finances. I I could almost feel the ripple through the system as the safeguards activated a chain reaction that began with a quiet complaint and ended with Patricia's access to estate-related funds being scrutinized in a way she had not anticipated, and the knowledge made something deep in my chest finally exhale, because this was not petty revenge or emotional retaliation, but the exact process meant to protect people like my father from exactly what had been done to him. Ms. Carter also filed a motion with the probate court requesting that no deeds be transferred, no loans expanded, and no assets liquidated until the validity of the new will could be determined. And I imagined Patricia pacing in her kitchen as the notifications came through, realizing her smooth path through my father's property had turned into a maze of holds and reviews and pending investigations, each one a product of the truth rather than personal vendetta. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment with the blinds drawn and the city quiet outside, I felt a steadiness I had not felt since before the hospital call. Not joy exactly, but a sense that the ground beneath me was no longer tilting. And I thought about the people who had sat in the church fellowship hall whispering about greedy daughters and grateful wives, and I found myself wanting to speak directly to them, to anyone who had watched a sick relative sign confusing papers and wondered whether it was truly what they meant, and a sentence formed in my mind, the kind that belongs in the middle of a story, meant to reach people who have lived through their own quiet injustices. A sentence that said, if you have ever seen someone sign something they did not understand, you know this feeling. And if you have thoughts about it, I want to hear them, because what comes next is where everything finally begins to turn. And as I turned off the lights and walked toward my bedroom, I realized the next phase would not be about grief anymore. It would be about consequences. Real financial consequences for the woman who believed no one would ever question the version of events she had crafted. And for the first time since the reading of the will, I felt the first faint outline of power returning to my hands. The mediation was scheduled for a gray morning in early March, and as I walked into the probate conference room with Miss Carter at my side, I felt the familiar mix of dread and clarity tightening across my ribs, the same feeling I used to get in high-stakes fraud briefings when I knew something irreversible was about to be placed on the table, and the room itself looked deceptively calm with its long, polished wood surface and a tray of untouched water bottles in the center. At one end sat Trish in a tailored coat that looked too expensive for the occasion, her posture straight and her face arranged in a soft mask of tired virtue. And beside her was attorney Hanley, shifting through papers with the distracted air of a man who believed he already knew how the next hour would unfold. At the opposite side of the table sat a representative from Adult Protective Services, a serious woman with a badge clipped to her belt and a notebook open in front of her. And next to her sat Joan, her hands folded tightly, her eyes steady but frightened, and I slid into the chair between Joan and Miss Carter, trying to quiet the pounding in my ears. The mediator, a probate officer with a neutral voice, began by explaining that the goal was to clarify issues around the estate and see whether resolution was possible without a full evidentiary hearing. And as soon as she paused long enough for the first party to speak, Trish leaned forward with a breathy sigh that was almost theatrical, saying she had cared for my father alone for years, that she had managed his medications, monitored his health, kept the shop running, and made sure he was never alone. And she said it with a tone of moral exhaustion that made her sound like a widow who had carried the weight of the world while an absent daughter lived her life elsewhere. She turned her head just slightly so the entire room could hear her as she added that I barely visited during his last months, and that, of course, he had wanted to simplify things, that, of course, he had trusted her to handle the estate without conflict, because he had not wanted arguments over a broken-down cabin or an aging workshop. Then she looked directly at me with a small, sympathetic smile and said softly, "We both know you are too busy for property like that," as if she were consoling me instead of rewriting my father's intentions in front of a ledger of witnesses. The mediator glanced at Miss Carter, who lifted her folder with deliberate calm and spread out a series of documents across the polished table, saying she would like to walk everyone through a timeline because clarity mattered more than impressions, and the room shifted subtly as she began reading aloud the dates that had been taped to my apartment wall for weeks. Power of attorney updated on a specific day. Hospitalization 2 days later will change request filed. While he was still under sedation insurance, payout dispersed within days of the funeral, and a home equity line opened almost immediately after. As she slid copies of the documents toward the mediator and the APS representative, the room grew quieter until the only sound was the turning of paper. And then Miss Carter tapped one page gently with her pen, drawing attention to the medical note written in Joan's hand, the one that read, "Patient sedated, confused, asked repeatedly for daughter." And she said the phrase slowly so that everyone in the room heard it without interpretation. The APS representative leaned forward to read the note closely and then asked Joan if she could speak to the circumstances, and Joan's voice trembled for a moment before settling into something steadier, and she began recounting with painful precision the night my father signed the documents describing how he drifted in and out, how he asked where I was, how he tried to read but lost his place, and how Patricia had held the pen in his hand and guided it along the page, telling him everything was just routine and that I had already agreed. Joan went on saying she'd been afraid to speak up earlier because she had feared retaliation and loss of employment, but that her conscience had grown louder than her fear, and she repeated clearly that she had watched my father sign papers. He did not understand papers he was encouraged to sign by the person who benefited most from those signatures, and the room felt charged as if someone had cracked open a window and let in a sudden current of cold air. Even Hanley looked up sharply, his expression flickering through surprise and calculation, because he had clearly not been aware of the details around the signing. And before he could speak, the APS representative adjusted her glasses and said, "Based on these documents and this testimony, we have opened a file for suspected elder financial exploitation." And the words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples across every face at the table. Tricia's hand tightened around the edge of her folder so hard I saw her knuckles whiten, and she began to sputter, that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had only been trying to protect my father from stress, that Joan was mistaken or misremembering, but her voice no longer sounded soft and patient. It carried an edge that cracked through the image she had been curating for months. I did not speak until the room settled again, until every eye had moved between the documents and the frozen expression on Tricia's face. And then I asked one simple question, in a quiet, even tone, if my father wanted me out completely. Why did he email me a copy of his will in 2020 that says cabin to my daughter Mila? And I held up the printed email with its original metadata, while Ms. Carter slid another copy toward the mediator to verify authenticity. The mediator scanned the document comparing signatures and timestamps and then looked toward the APS representative, who nodded slightly as if confirming the significance of what she saw, and the room fell into a hush, so deep I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. After several minutes of reviewing the documents, the probate officer spoke with the measured cadence of someone aware that every word mattered, saying that the 2024 will appeared deeply compromised, that the sequence of changes raised significant concerns about capacity and influence, and that pending further proceedings, the court would revert to the 2020 will as the operative document and freeze any further transfer or borrowing against estate property. I watched the decision strike Trish like a physical blow, watched the way her composure wavered as she realized this was no longer a family disagreement, but a state-recognized investigation, no longer her narrative, but a documented case with multiple witnesses. And for the first time since the reading of the will, I felt the room tilt back into alignment, not in triumph, but in the quiet, fierce relief of truth, finally standing on its own legs in a space where no one could brush it aside. The court's final ruling arrived in early July after months of slow filings and scheduled hearings. And when the envelope came, I sat at my small kitchen table staring at it for a long breath before opening it, then reading the words that confirmed what the mediator had already signaled: the 2024 will was void for lack of capacity and suspected undue influence, and the estate would revert to the 2020 will, meaning the cabin, the woodworking shop, and a portion of my father's investment account now legally transferred to me, while Trish retained only the marital share she had been entitled to. Before everything she orchestrated, the ruling phrased so clinically it almost disguised the truth that her attempt to seize control had collapsed under the weight of her own ambition. In the same packet was notice that the probate judge had ordered continued monitoring of certain transactions made in the days around my father's hospitalization, which meant the bank compliance department I had quietly alerted weeks earlier now had full authority to flag and review the insurance payout that had been deposited into Trish's new account. And when the internal team froze the funds pending verification, she struck the first real wall of consequence, the kind she could not charm or intimidate away, and I imagined her sitting in her kitchen, staring at a balance she thought she owned, only to discover it was no longer accessible. Word spread in the community not through headlines, but through whisper networks at church gatherings and grocery store aisles, and people who once praised her devotion began avoiding eye contact, and the same women who had added their little digs about me at the funeral reception now shifted awkwardly when they saw me. One of them catching me outside the church. After a Sunday service, I finally felt ready to attend, saying in a hushed, almost embarrassed tone that she thought I had been greedy and dramatic and that she had been wrong, her confession awkward but genuine, and I accepted it quietly because I did not need her apology, but I understood the power of people realizing they had misjudged you. When I finally drove up to the cabin with the official key in my hand, the gravel crunching under the car tires sounded different, almost like the place was greeting me instead of bracing against me, and walking inside felt like stepping into a memory that had been waiting in suspended breath, the smell of cedar, the faint drafts through the old windows, the worn table still showing the dents from decades of tools being set down a little too hard, and for a moment, I stood still, letting the mix of grief and relief settle, because getting the property back did not erase what had been done, but it restored something vital. The promise my father had always made that this place would be my anchor, if life ever turned. I walked into the shop next door and ran my fingers over the workbench, the clamps and chisels still organized the way he had liked them, and whispered to the empty room that I would make decisions worthy of the trust he had placed in me, and that no matter how messy the road had been, I had made it here without taking shortcuts or lying or using fear to get what I wanted. Over the next weeks, I met with a mortgage officer I trusted and refinanced the cabin and shop under terms far better than anything Trish could have secured my steady income, strong credit, and existing assets, giving me leverage. And as I signed the paperwork, I caught the loan officer glancing at the numbers on my financial profile with a small, surprised respect. The duplex in Knoxville, the rental income, the investment account approaching $200,000, the stability Trish had always insisted I lacked, and I realized this was the first time someone in this story actually saw me as a financially capable adult. I spent late evenings cleaning the cabin, sweeping out dust from the corners, washing linens, fixing small things my father used to patch temporarily with tape or string, and it felt strangely healing to reclaim the space with my own hands, like I was stitching together something that had been ripped open. Then one afternoon, while I was organizing the old paperwork, I found a letter addressed to my father's estate from a mortgage company with Trish's name bold across the top, informing her she was 2 months behind on payments for her personal house. And the moment I read the overdue amount, I understood the ripple effect she was facing, the legal fees draining her savings, the frozen insurance payout, the loss of access to my father's accounts, the halted equity line on the cabin she had counted on, everything she had relied on, tightening like a fist around her finances. I set the letter down and let the reality wash over me, not in gloating satisfaction, but in a steady awareness that choices have consequences, and that what she had done to my father and attempted to do to me now boomeranged back, creating an unraveling she could no longer control. And for the first time, it occurred to me that the imbalance between us had reversed completely. She sinking deeper into obligations she could not meet, while I stood on ground my father had always intended me to stand on. I drove to the workshop that evening and opened the wide doors, letting the summer light pour across the floorboards. And I imagined how the place would look once I updated a few things, maybe turning a corner of it into a small showroom, or documenting his old craftsmanship online so his patterns and designs could live longer than this one building. And the idea filled me with a quiet sense of direction, because I was not just inheriting something, I was choosing how to carry it forward. Later that night, sitting on the cabin porch with the air turning cooler and the trees rustling softly, I realized the full weight of the twist the outline of my life had been building toward, that I had never needed the inheritance to survive because I had already built my own financial footing, and that reclaiming the cabin and workshop did not make me whole. But it did place the truth back in my hands instead of in the mouth of someone who had tried to control every narrative. And as I looked out at the darkening line of trees, I felt something like peace settling across my chest, not because Trish was losing her grip on the life she had constructed, but because I had finally stepped into the role my father must have imagined when he quietly told me years ago that the land, the shop, and the cabin would always be my safety net. And now, instead of falling into it, I was choosing how to stand on it. It was a cold, bright afternoon when Trish finally drove up the gravel road to the cabin, and I knew it was her before I even saw the car. There's a particular way dread crawls up your spine when the past comes back wearing a familiar shape, and by the time she stepped out, I was already standing in the doorway with a mug of tea in my hand, more centered than I had ever been around her, watching as the woman who used to glide into rooms now climbed the steps in a worn coat, with a fraying cuff and mascara smudged in faint shadows under her eyes, her hair pulled back without its usual careful gloss. She had a thick envelope clutched in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, and when she reached the porch, she gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "They are threatening foreclosure. Mila, if you co-sign, I can keep the house. Your father would not want me on the street." And she said it in that old soft voice, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable and wounded at the same time, then added after everything I did for him, as if the years of my childhood and my own grief had been edited out of the record. I stepped aside and told her to come in. My heart not pounding this time, just steady and in the small kitchen that now felt like mine. I poured her a cup of tea and set it on the table, then sat across from her while she spread the papers out. Mortgage statements, late notices, a letter with bold print about default, all of them pieces of a life that had been built on the assumption that certain streams of money would always flow in her direction. She talked quickly at first, explaining how the investigation had scared off a buyer for the cabin, how legal fees had eaten through her savings, how the insurance funds had been held longer than expected, each sentence a quiet admission that the system she had tried to control had turned around and set limits she could not bend, and every few lines she circled back to my father, to his supposed wishes, saying he would not want to see her lose everything he would want me to help. I let her talk until the words began looping. Then I rested my hands lightly on the table and spoke in a calm voice that did not shake you, locked me out of his room. You told the hospital I was barely present. You stood in that conference room and smiled, while a will he barely understood erased my name from the home he promised me. You stood in a church full of people and rewrote my love for him as laziness and selfishness that was not about protecting him, that was about controlling everything. And as I said it, I watched a small flinch move across her face, because for the first time, there was no performance in my voice, only a clear recounting of facts. She started to protest, saying things had been complicated, that decisions had to be made quickly, that I did not understand how much pressure she had been under and underneath the excuses. I could hear the same old pattern, the one where she centered herself in every story, but this time it did not pull me in. It just sounded tired. I took a breath and told her something I had been turning over in my head for weeks. "I do not hate you," I said, and it surprised us both a little, because it was true the hate had burned up in the process of documenting what she did. What I feel is distance and a line I will not sign my name onto your consequences. Those are yours to carry. And as the words left my mouth, I could feel their weight settling into the space between us like a drawn curtain, soft but absolute. For a second, her expression crumpled into something that looked like genuine fear. Then the familiar flash of anger pushed through, and the mask she had been holding onto slipped. "You are just like her. You know, she snapped your mother, always walking away when it got hard, and there it was. The last little shard of poison she had been saving, flung at me like it could knock me back into the child she used to talk over. I thought about my mother then, about the woman who had left my father when I was young because she had run out of ways to be heard in a house that made her small. And for the first time, I considered that maybe walking away had been the one choice she had still owned. So I looked at Trish and answered, without raising my voice. Maybe walking away was the only power she had left today. This is mine. I am not walking away from what is mine. I am walking away from your idea that I owe you my signature for the rest of your life. She stared at me, eyes bright and furious lips pressed so tightly together the color drained from them, then gathered the stack of papers with a sharp movement, the envelope crinkling in her grip, and for a heartbeat I saw it clearly. The realization that the girl she had once dismissed as delicate and impractical was the only person in town who could save her house, and that this same girl had just chosen not to. She tried one last angle, saying, "Your father loved you. He would want you to be kind." And I answered, "He loved me and he trusted me, and I am honoring him by refusing to help you undo the consequences of what you did to his name." Then I stood up and walked to the door, not slamming it, just opening it, giving her a way out that did not involve another argument, and after a long moment she rose and stepped past me, shoulders a little hunched. Perfume faded, moving down the porch steps. She used to climb as if she owned each board. I watched her walk to the car, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel pulled after her by guilt or fear. I felt rooted where I was, in a house that had been taken from me, and returned in a life I was finally steering without trying to fix everyone else's damage. Over the next months, I poured my energy into turning the cabin into something new, a modest retreat where women could come for a few days when their lives had been cracked open by divorce, or by caring for a parent through illness, or by the quiet exhaustion of being the responsible one for too long. I kept the kitchen simple and warm, added extra quilts to the beds, created a small library in the corner of the living room with books about boundaries and money and grief that I wish someone had handed my mother and me years ago. And as bookings started trickling in through word of mouth, I took a portion of the rental income and set up a small fund in my father's name, and mine, the Tom and Mila Fund, dedicated to helping people cover legal fees when they suspected elder financial abuse but felt too broke or too scared to start the process. The first time we were able to pay for an initial consultation for a woman whose brother had emptied their father's account while he was in a rehab facility, I sat on the porch after the call and cried not from sadness, but from the fierce relief of knowing that some part of what we had gone through was being turned into a shield for someone else instead of just a scar. On quiet evenings, I sat on the front steps with a mug of tea, watching the light fade through the trees, and I would think about how money could be both weapon and shelter, how it had been used against my father and then used by me to correct what had been done. And I knew down to my bones that money itself was not the enemy. The silence around it was the way people were shamed for asking questions or standing up for what was promised to them. Losing my father still hurt every day. No court order could rewrite that. But using what he left in a way that honored who he really was helped transform the story from one where I was the powerless daughter who lost everything to one where I was the woman who refused to let a lie be the final word. And if you have ever been called greedy or ungrateful or dramatic just because you dared to protect what was supposed to be yours, I hope you hear something in this that loosens the shame in your chest. If you have your own story about being painted as the problem when you were only trying to hold the line, write it down below. I read every single comment, and if this long, quiet fight for a fair ending made you think, finally, someone said it out loud, tap like and subscribe so I can keep sharing more stories where justice shows up in small, steady ways, even when the whole world tells you to sit down and be quiet.